Welcome, everyone. This is the third and final session of our Special Advocacy Town Hall series. My name is Rich Profit, and I'm the chair of the board at RTO-ERO. We are a bilingual trusted voice on healthy active living in the retirement journey. We work with our members and partners to advocate for critical policy improvements to address urgent needs now and create a more secure and compassionate future for everyone. We had a great turnout for the first two town hall events. If you missed the senior strategies and geriatric healthcare sessions, check out our YouTube channel for the recordings. During today's town hall webinar, we will hear from representatives from three of Ontario's main political parties as we address one of our key advocacy issues, environmental stewardship. As we begin the event, I would like to ask Ashvina Govindaraju, the manager of our benefits team, to share the land acknowledgement in English and French. She will also provide active offer in French during the Q&A portion of this event. Ashvina?
Thank you, Rich. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hello, everyone. I am speaking to you today from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge, recognize, and honor the ancestral traditional territories on which we live and work, and the contributions of all Indigenous peoples to our communities and our nation. Je m'adresse à vous aujourd'hui du territoire traditionnel de nombreuses nations, incluant les peuples Mississaugas de Crédit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee et Wendat. Ce territoire abrite aujourd'hui de nombreux membres des peuples des Premières Nations, Inuits et Métis. Nous reconnaissons et honorons les territoires traditionnels ancestraux sur lesquels nous vivons et travaillons, ainsi que la contribution de tous les peuples autochtones à nos communautés et à notre nation. Merci, thank you, miigwech. As Rich mentioned, I will provide active offer for any participants who wish to ask questions or have information relayed in French. Now, throughout the town hall, please feel free to use the Q&A chat box to submit your questions for our panelists. Comme Rich l'a mentionné, je suis ici pour assurer une offre active à tous les participants qui souhaitent poser des questions ou se faire relayer des informations en français. Tout au long de cette séance de discussion, n'hésitez surtout pas de soumettre vos questions à nos panélistes en utilisant la boîte de discussion Q&A. Enjoy the town hall. Rich, back to you.
Thanks, Ashvina. I know everyone joining the call is looking forward to hearing from our guests today to learn more about their party's stance on the environment. We invited representatives from the four main parties in Ontario to participate in our town hall events to help us prepare for the upcoming election on June the 2nd. Unfortunately, after extensive outreach to the PC Party of Ontario, we did not get a response from their office. However, we are thankful to the three parties who kindly accepted our invitation and provided representatives to speak with us and address our questions. Representatives joining us today are Diane Sachs, Environment and Climate Critic and Deputy Leader of the Ontario Green Party, Katie Gibbs, Liberal Party of Ontario candidate for Ottawa Centre, and MPP Sandy Shaw, Environment, Conservation and Parks Critic and representative for the Ontario New Democratic Party. It is important to have these conversations and address how the government can work together to tackle the climate crisis. Each panelist will have 10 minutes to introduce themselves and speak about their party's position on this issue. RTO-ERO members and guests, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit your question in English or French, and we will try to get to as many as possible following the presentation. We will start with Diane Sachs from the Ontario Green Party. Diane?
Hello, I didn't know I was going to be first. Okay, here we go. Do you see my slides?
Yes, we do.
Okay, it's there. Great. So I would like you to start by thinking about a young person that you love. Because we already know that the climate crisis has changed dramatically their future. And we know that we've reached the point where the best case in their lifetime is widespread death and suffering. And the worst case is humanity on the brink of extinction. We are in code red, as we've heard over and over again from the scientists of the world, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the largest scientific collaboration in human history, has told us again and again and again this year, people and planet are getting clobbered. Physical and mental health is being badly damaged already around the world, with much more ahead, and any further delay means death. And I'm here to tell you today that the only party whose platform is serious about this and consistent with the science that we've had from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is, unsurprisingly, the Green Party. This is our raison d'etre. Now, we know that Canadians tend to think that, we're pretty good, that we're climate leaders, and actually we're the worst in the G7. We're very heavy climate polluters, and we've done less than any of the other major countries to reduce our climate pollution. And it's not just affecting the climate, huge impacts on our health and practically anything else that you care about. So we can still have a better future. There is still a little window disappearing pretty rapidly for us to be winners in the new climate economy. And there's 3 key steps that we have to follow. We have to crush climate pollution. We have to restore water and nature. And we have to not leave people behind. We have to succeed together. Obviously, in 10 minutes, I can't tell you very much about this, but I'll tell you some of the key points. 3 absolutely indispensable parts of any climate plan that is consistent with the science has to have these 3 things that none of the other parties have. A serious total carbon budget for Ontario for the rest of the century, a serious carbon price on all the carbon pollution across our economy, and electrifying everything by doubling our electricity system. This is the only way we can do it. We have to start with a zero carbon law, our fair share carbon budget. People who talk about net zero by this year or that year are just telling you what year they're going to turn the tap off, not how much is going to go into the bathtub. And that isn't going to stop us from climate catastrophe. And it has to be real zero, not a wishy-washy net zero. So you get the federal Liberals. I don't know what the policy is going to be of the provincial Liberals because they don't have a platform yet, but the federal Liberals and the NDP both say, oh, don't worry, we're going to plant lots of trees. Planting trees is great, but they don't live that long now in the area of mega fires and plant pests everywhere. We've seen all around the world, all kinds of forests that we were told were sequestering carbon already burn. That doesn't count. And it's absolutely essential that we have no more fossil lock-in. And so when the NDP, the Liberals, and the Conservatives all voted on March 3rd, 3 days after the climate report, to give $1 billion a year to car owners, that was going exactly in the wrong direction. And I've heard Peter say, oh, we had to do it for Indigenous kids. No, that bill doesn't do anything good for Indigenous kids. If we get into that, I'll tell you more about it afterwards. We have to have a serious carbon fee on everything. And again, this is a huge difference between our party and all the other parties. Again, don't know what the Liberals' plan is going to be, but the federal Liberal carbon fee isn't high enough to create a financial incentive to transition to the green economy. And the NDP plan puts no carbon fee at all on the majority of our economy. Less than 1/3 of the emissions in Ontario come from industry. And most of those industries trade internationally. If we put an enormous carbon fee on everything produced by those industries, we will simply drive them out of business, drive them out of the province. We won't do any climate benefit. We'll just drive the jobs out of Ontario. So a serious carbon fee has to be on everything. And then we have to electrify everything that we now do with fossil fuels, almost everything. And that means doubling our electricity supply by 2040. And we can do that. We've shown that with really detailed modeling, how we do that with clean electricity, with renewables, with storage, no new nuclear, and we phase out the gas plants. And in the meantime, we've got to stop building more fossil pipelines. We've got to stop dangerous pipelines like Line 5. Again, Green Party, the only one that voted to shut that down because it's a real hazard to the Great Lakes. We have to deal with transport, stopping sprawl. Sprawl is our oil sands in Ontario. We absolutely have to stop it. You won't find the word sprawl in the NDP plan. Again, don't know what's in the Liberal plan. Stopping sprawl is absolutely critical to our plan. We've got to put walking and biking and transit before cars. We've shown how to do that. We've got to clean the GO school and transit buses, which are now diesel fired, and many of them very old and very badly polluting. And we do need some incentives for electric cars, trucks, and bikes, which are all in our plan. And then we have to deal with buildings, which is, again, the third largest source of emissions in Ontario. And one of the things we have to do, even the International Energy Agency told us this, is we have to stop. There must be no more new gas-fired furnaces anywhere in the world starting in 2025. And that has to be happening here too. That's crushing climate pollution. We have to protect water and nature. And there's so much we can do, especially in partnership with Indigenous communities. We're the only party that's pledged $1 billion for Indigenous climate leadership. Love to talk more about that if we have time. And then, of course, we have to deal with equity. Because who needs climate action the most? It's the most vulnerable. The most vulnerable will suffer the most from climate chaos, and they are likely to suffer the most from the action we have to take to stop climate chaos. So we have to pay careful attention to integrating equity into our climate and environmental plans, which is why it's the third pillar of our climate plan, and matched with our other two central policies, which are on mental health and on housing. Here are some of the key things that we have put in our plan to make sure that we do succeed together. Disadvantaged communities to receive 25% of the overall benefits, a climate bonus for low income, guaranteed green jobs for at least 60,000 people, a year of free college for green trades, and a year of guaranteed employment. A dedicated adaptation fund. Again, none of the other parties, as far as we know, have got a dedicated adaptation levy so that we actually can pay for the adaptation needs that we already have, which is already over $2 billion a year. So no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. There's only 5 weeks left in this election campaign. If you think about that young person that you love, we owe it to them to do what we can to fix the problem that we've caused. Most of the climate pollution in the world has occurred during the working lifetime of the people on this call. The price is mostly going to be paid by the young people. We still have a window to make good on what we've done. We still have a window to be able to look those young people in the eye and say, we fixed what we caused. You're going to have a good future. We didn't abandon you to this mess. And that is why I joined the Green Party, because it's the only one serious. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane. And if you could thank you, Diane. Thank you, Diane. And now Katie Gibbs, the Ontario Liberal Party candidate for Ottawa Centre. Katie?
Yes, well, thank you so much. First, a big thank you to RTO for hosting this event today and inviting me. There's no doubt that the climate crisis is the defining crisis that we face, and it impacts every other issue that Ontarians care about. Healthcare, housing, inequality, the economy, all of them are affected by the climate crisis. And as the last IPCC report so clearly stated, we are at a now or never moment for climate action. And this has to be a main issue as we head into the election on June 2nd. So I'm thrilled to be here. This has to be a nonpartisan issue. So I'm delighted to be here alongside Green and NDP colleagues who are also passionate about this issue, because I think the reality is that Ontarians need us all working together to bring solutions to this crisis. So for me personally, this is the number one reason why I'm running for office. My background is in environmental sciences. I have a PhD in conservation biology. And I think that we need more elected officials who truly understand the scale and the urgency of the climate crisis, and who are going to push for it to be at the core of all the decisions that the government makes, not just explicitly environmental ones. I am also a mom of two very young kids. My kids are 5 and 2. You know, we've already heard lots of talk about thinking about the future generations, and certainly that's something I think about every day, and is what drives me. You know, certainly I am very worried about what the future is going to look like for them if we don't rise to meet this moment and take all the necessary actions that we can to slow the climate crisis. And, you know, let's be clear, what we're talking about is a big thing. Meeting our climate goals is going to require large scale changes across all of society and government and business on a very short timeline. So we need to have an ambitious target, but it's not enough to just have an ambitious target. We also have to have a detailed, feasible plan for how we're actually going to reach it if we're going to have any hope of making it a reality. So I think, you know, the question that Ontarians need to ask themselves is, who has the best plan and who has the best ability to form government and implement that plan? And there's no doubt in my mind that the answer to that question is the Ontario Liberal Party, which is why I'm running and why I'm running as an Ontario Liberal. As Diane mentioned, our full climate plan is not yet been released. It's coming out very soon. So I can't reveal all of the details today, but I can give you some of the core themes and some of the details that are out already. So our plan does commit to net zero by 2050, and we will have an ambitious 2030 target as well, because that is so crucial. And our plan is going to cut emissions and grow a clean economy with green jobs. Our plan is also fully costed and modeled. Our emissions reductions are modeled until 2030. We really want to get this right and show Ontarians how we're going to meet that ambitious goal. So we're also going to have in the plan some mechanisms to make government more transparent and accountable on how we're progressing to meet those emission reductions so that Ontarians can see the progress, because we can't wait until 2030 to see how we've done. So we're going to make that whole process of showing how we're doing and how we're getting there more transparent so that we can be held accountable for the ambitious target that we're putting out there. So some highlights from the plan. It's going to focus on growing a clean economy, bringing green jobs to Ontario. We're going to make large polluters pay and use those funds to support research and commercialization of new technologies. We're going to bring thousands of good green jobs to Ontario. We are going to keep our electricity system one of the cleanest in the world. You know, many people might not realize this, but Ontario actually has one of the lowest emitting electricity systems. This is in large part thanks to previous Liberal governments who phased out coal and invested in non-emitting electricity sources. Now, the challenge here is that the Ford government is quickly undoing a lot of our progress on this. They are already increasing capacity in gas power plants, and this is already increasing our emissions. And if left unchecked, you know, this is projected to increase our emissions from electricity by 600%. So we are absolutely going in the wrong direction right now, which we cannot let this happen. So we will work to keep our electricity system green. We will change how we move people and goods in this province. We need to focus on rapidly electrifying our transportation system and investing in active transportation infrastructure and public transit so that people can also choose to not take cars at all for more of their trips. So we have said that we will bring back the rebate for electric vehicles. It is an $8,000 rebate for a new electric vehicle purchase and up to $1,500 for charging infrastructure. We're also going to expand vehicle charging stations in apartment buildings, workplaces, parking lots, on city streets, on the at the GO stations, really just making it easier for people to charge and building up that infrastructure so that we can rapidly transition to electric vehicles. Our plan is going to have record investments in public transit. While the Ford government is spending billions on building new highways and expanding highways, we are going to instead invest in public transit. We are also going to have dedicated funding for municipalities to increase and improve their cycling infrastructure, which is so crucial for us meeting our climate and environmental goals, and also just crucial for having more vibrant, active cities that are fun places to live and be. Another big part of the plan is around nature-based solutions for climate resilience. So we need to protect the many carbon sinks that we have in the province and do what we can to restore more natural lands. This is going to help reduce our emissions, but it's also going to help make our communities and our province more resilient. So we have said we are going to plant 800 million trees over the next 8 years. We are also committing to protecting 30% of lands in Ontario as protected areas, which is up from 10%, which is what it is currently. So that is incredibly ambitious and is going to protect a lot of the green spaces in Ontario and make our province more resilient. Another focus area is going to be buildings. We need to have high performance buildings for all Ontarians. Buildings are a huge source of emissions, especially with the climate like ours, where it's very hot and very cold. So we are going to have a plan that focuses on strengthening the building code so that new buildings have to meet a higher performance standard, and also supports there for people to retrofit existing buildings as well. So, I think, like I said, the full details are not out yet, but that kind of gives you an overview, and you can see from that, we are going to have a very concrete, detailed, but still ambitious plan. I think that, realistically, no government has done enough on climate, or we wouldn't be in this mess. But the Ontario Liberals have a strong track record of bold climate action in the past, and we're ready to do it again going forward. It was an Ontario Liberal government that closed the coal plants. It was an Ontario Liberal government that protected the green belts. It was an Ontario Liberal government that put a price on carbon. So we have taken bold climate action before, and we are ready to do it again with a bold plan for how we can both reduce emissions, grow our clean economy, and just create a more vibrant, healthy communities for all Ontarians. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katie. And finally, we have MPP Sandy Shaw, representative for the Ontario Democratic Party. Sandy?
Thanks, Rich. And thank you so much for having me. I want to thank the RTO and the ERO for hosting this. It's so very important. I did take the time to read your white paper, and I would have to say the things that are important to you are important to almost every Ontarian, maybe with the exception of Doug Ford and his government. But I would say what you're putting forward is something that we need kind of leadership. We need leadership in government. We need leadership in community, and we need leadership from people like you to address this. Because, and to my colleagues, to Katie and Diane, hi Diane, nice to see you. Katie, we haven't met before, but I'm sure we will. And really, I want to assure you that that the things that you've said today are so important, and especially Katie, you said that this is a non-partisan issue. I think that's true. Good ideas aren't limited to one party or one group, and we need to build on all of those ideas. We need all hands on deck to address this climate crisis. And Diane, you've done a fantastic job of describing the scale and the urgency of the climate crisis. We know that we need to act. We needed to act yesterday, really, to address the worst impacts of climate change. And unfortunately, we've had a government for the last 4 years that has not only just stalled that progress, that they have dragged us backwards when it comes to the urgent action that we need. And, you know, like I've said, we all are worried in our own way about our future. And, you know, we talked about parents being concerned, and Diane, you talked about a loved one in your life. And I'm just going to share with you that I am a grandmother of 7 grandchildren. It's a miracle to me. I don't know how it happened, but I'm proudly the grandmother of 7 wonderful children. And one of my grandsons, I'll just share the story with you. We were, you know, he was on his computer and I don't know what I was doing, you know, and I just heard him kind of cry out. And I said, what's wrong? I thought he'd hurt himself. And he said, Nan, will there be nature left when I grow up? He's 8 years old. So I, of course, kind of reassured him, said, oh, don't worry about it, it'll be there. But honestly, in my gut, I thought, in what world is this, that an 8-year-old has fear and anxiety and in some ways sort of, you know, in some ways despondent about the future that he is facing. And so that's what motivates all of us, right? That's what puts the fire in my belly to do what we all need to do. And so, I mean, we also need to, when we talk about these good plans and when we're moving forward, we have to keep our grandkids and our loved ones in our mind, but we also have to make sure that we're keeping in our mind the communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change. I mean, there's agricultural and rural communities that are seeing flooding, that are damaging crops and eroding soil. We see municipalities, small municipalities that can't afford to repair the infrastructure damages to their roads and their major systems, and that tax is borne by taxpayers. You know, like low-income working class people, they're going to bear the cost, actual cost of this, if we don't keep them in mind when we develop our plans. Indigenous peoples, they need to be set. We need to center this plan on their knowledge and their experience. I mean, racialized communities, the list goes on and on of the people that we need to center in our plan. And I would just say that that's why the Green New Democratic Deal that we put out about, I think it's COVID years, but I think it was about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. It seems like a really long time ago. But that's why I'm so proud of this, is because it is based in equity and inclusion and reconciliation. I mean, that's the fundamental pieces of it. I also would like to say that its subtitle, if you will, is Climate, Jobs, and Justice, because we've put together a plan that will address it talks about all of the pieces that Katie and Diane were touching on. Some of the fundamental pieces are in the Green New Democratic Deal. If you want to see all of the list of the things that we've committed to, and I can talk about it here, you can see that online. But what I would like to share with you that it also is building on the idea of a just transition. And we all know that in the middle of COVID, we kept talking about build back better. We saw that things got torn down. We saw that things were possible. We could change, and that we could have a hopeful, optimistic vision for our future. So the Green New Democratic Deal builds on the idea of a just transition. We understand that the urgency of the climate crisis, we get it entirely. We also understand that this is an opportunity for us to build new economies, to build a new market, to invest in clean tech, to invest in technologies that will get us to the kind of change that we need, but we also do not want to leave anyone behind. So we will center this on jobs that are for people that need to transition from fossil fuels, but we'll also include people that currently do not have work and could use work in good green infrastructure jobs. And we'll also make sure that we include in this people, individuals like us that want to play our part. So we will make it easy for people to purchase electric vehicles, to pay for charging stations. We will make it again possible for them to do the kind of retrofits on their home that they would like to do. And building on one of the commitments or one of the concerns that you have, the RTO-ERO has, which is around plastics and waste, we will also help people to understand when they take the time to recycle, when they are concerned about the life cycle of plastics, that they can be reassured that when they put something in the recycling box, that it actually is part of not a linear cycle of waste, that it's part of a full cycle of waste. So that's a commitment that we have that is something that we share with your organization and some of the priorities that you've put forth. you know, I could give you the list. I mean, I would just like to say to Diane, in fact, Diane came to my community in Hamilton when I hosted one of the very first Know Your Rights workshops, and was very kind and generous to come to Hamilton to have a town hall on climate change. And building from there, I mean, that room was packed. It was a church and it was packed with people of all stripes that wanted to play their part and understand what they could do to address climate change. And so the message that I'm trying to get across here is that governments need to do the part. We have to have good policy. We have to have a good government, but we also need to mobilize everyone to address this climate crisis. And when we organize and when we are informed with good information as a community, we can win. And so I would like to say that, you know, our commitment, the New Democratic's commitment to stopping sprawl, to having to enhancing a firm urban boundary. I would like to take credit for this, not me credit, but my city, but this Stop Sprawl movement started here in Hamilton. I mean, that was a phenomenal group of people here in Hamilton organized and mobilized and got the city of Hamilton to freeze their urban boundary. And that movement is spreading across Ontario. And what's so phenomenal about that movement, it's that people saw through the ruse of what Doug Ford is doing, that his urban boundary expansion, they saw this as a land grab and as an expansion that would lock in climate increases, emissions for years, that would pave over good green farmland. We're losing 175 acres of farmland a day. So they saw it for what it was, and that they mobilized and organized to push back on this federal government, the provincial government's, Doug Ford's continued assault on our protected and our green spaces. And, you know, the list for Doug Ford's, the outrages that he's committed against our environment is long. I think we all have our few favorites. I just need to underscore, you know, what he's done to the Greenbelt. I mean, he tried like 3 times to carve it up and deliver it to connected land speculators and donors. He's planning to build a $10 to $12 billion highway through the Greenbelt. He gutted the Conservation Authority's ability to protect our water and our wastewater. This is the Doug Ford government, and people are starting to, you know, people see this and are starting to organize in their own communities and to push back and to fight against this government. So let me just end by saying, yes, this is a nonpartisan issue. Yes, we all need to work together. People expect, our kids expect nothing less of us. The people of Ontario expect nothing less of us. I will say right now, Ontario's official opposition, NDP, there's 40 of us. It's a caucus of 40 people who have been day in and day out holding Doug Ford to account and Doug Ford's government to account. We have the Liberals, you know, have 7 members who have done their job. The Greens currently have 1 MPP in the House. These are people that bring good ideas and we will be prepared to work with. But really, if we want to stop Doug Ford, we need to ensure that our strong caucus continues to be there, and that we are the government that will bring a Green New Democratic deal and a just transition, and we are in the best position to stop Doug Ford's continued steamrolling of our environment, our rights, and the future for our children. So thank you very much for your time today.
Well done, all 3 of you. I'm Jim Grieve, the CEO of RTO ERO. And before Rich and I wade into, believe me, the specific questions that are emerging, a couple of things. I want to thank Diane and Katie and Sandy for outlining the positions that are held by each of the parties. There's a lot of commonality here, which is good news, because this is, as we've said, nonpartisan, all in. We've all got to be part of the solution. Diane, I just remind you that the chat is not functioning for the participants. So it's just distracting. If you don't mind, we'll just focus on the Q&A and we'll send the questions your way. Before we do that, I'm just going to remind you that it is perfectly fine to ask your question in English or in French. And Ashvina is going to remind you how that's going to work. Ashvina.
Merci, Jim. À nouveau, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Vous pouvez toujours poser vos questions en français ou en anglais en utilisant la boîte de questions et réponses au bas de vos écrans. Et si vous souhaitez que votre question soit posée à une panéliste spécifique, veuillez l'indiquer. Nous ferons de notre mieux pour poser le plus de questions possible. Thank you, Jim. Hello again, everyone. We are still accepting your questions, so please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions in English or French. And if you would like for your question to be asked of a specific panelist, please indicate that. We will do our best to address as many questions as we can. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ashvina. So let's get right to the questions, and there are lots and lots of them. So one of the first questions that we need to pose to you is, in what way will your party commit to support renewable energy? And in that question, I'm wondering if you can deal with the issue of batteries that use lithium, batteries that need to be in some way either buried or recycled, and the issue of nuclear power. So just a little question. And we'll start right with you, Sandy. We left off with you, and we'll go back in reverse order.
Yeah, it's just a small question. So the idea of renewables, I mean, we know that renewable energy needs to be the centerpiece to how we are going to address and get to the kind of net zero that we're looking for to keep climate, the 1.5% to commit to that. We need renewable energy is a key piece of this. People have also good questions about how, what will the life cycle be and the net impact be of renewables. But I think the science and the evidence are in that is the way to go. I know when it comes to nuclear, the idea of understanding the problem of not only the cost, the impact, and the waste, the idea of addressing the waste of the nuclear industry are important considerations. It's not an easy subject, but it's something that we all need to turn our focus on because we do need to transition. That is what we need to do. We need to continue to have a stable electric supply and a stable grid, but we also need to transition. So those are the kinds of things that we have considered, that we have taken the time to connect with people and meet with people, to meet with the experts, the scientists. We've taken all of that into consideration when we came forward with the Green New Democratic Deal. When it comes to maybe I have, Jim, I'm not sure. You talked about how we will support people. I think that's maybe what you said. I mean, we need to allow people to be part of the solution, and that the kinds of incentives and subsidies that people need to play a role in moving to renewables is something that we're committed to. I mean, I think I talked about the idea of investing in clean tech. So we need new technologies. We need affordable technologies that people can use and purchase and employ in their own individual lives, as well as in industrial commercial uses as well.
Thanks, Sandy. We'll go to you, Katie.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question, and I think it's really the question, right? So much of our climate plans revolve around electrifying things like transportation, and even how do we electrify heating and cooling for our homes. But that only works as a climate solution if we're keeping our electricity system green and non-emitting. And so it's the big question. It is kind of the elephant in the room. And there aren't easy answers. It is a hard question. We have to look at, of course, so historically Ontario has had an electricity surplus even, but with some of our nuclear going offline in the next few years, we're actually going to be coming into a real crunch point where we have to, for the first time in a long time, actually add a bunch of new electricity capacity to our grid. Ford's plan is to just use the gas power plants to do that. Obviously, that would be an absolute disaster for the climate, and we can't let that happen. And so the question is, how do we fill that gap, both to the current gap and then also the additional electricity needs we're going to have as we electrify everything? How do we fill that gap in a way that is non-emitting and that is also keeping electricity affordable, because that's certainly a challenge for many people, is the cost of electricity. And then how do we also keep it reliable? It has to be there when people need it, and it has to match when demand is there. And so that's really the balance. And so there's no doubt that right now the cost on renewables has come down substantially. And so we want to look at how can we ramp up renewables as fast as possible, while also figuring out that reliability factor, because there are still challenges there in terms of storage of renewables on large scales. So I think that's an area where, we're still sort of trying to figure out what are those answers. And another part of this is around small scale renewables. So I think one of the challenges is that our Ontario electricity system is really built around, having a few places that produce a lot of electricity. Whereas renewables don't really fit that model, right? They can be much more distributed. So we also want to look at how can we change, the kind of boring mechanics of how the electricity system works from the back end to make it easier for people to put solar on their rooftop, for example, make it easier for schools to hook up solar. So how could we also change it so that it's easier to have those kind of smaller scale renewable projects all across the province? And I think that there's a huge opportunity there too for rural communities in Northern Ontario. These are often communities that are currently using diesel, and there's huge opportunities there around helping them get on renewable, which also really just empowers them with, energy sovereignty, basically. So I think that's a really exciting thing that we want to explore. And on the batteries, I think we also have to think about that really strategically and look at how do we make sure that we're accounting for the environmental challenges of batteries, but also batteries are going to only be more and more important as we go forward. And so how do we also make sure that Ontario is a player in that economy? And so we're going to have some stuff in our plan looking at how do we make sure that we are also being a part of that growing economy around batteries, but making sure that we're doing it in a responsible fashion. So I could talk about electricity all day, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Katie. I just remind you that we got a lot of questions. I'm going to go to Diane for the same answer. Same question.
Hi, Jim. Well, I would also love to talk about electricity all day. As I hope you know, one of the major reports I delivered when I was the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario was on the electricity system. It's still the most up-to-date and detailed analysis of all of these questions, and I would encourage you to look at it. It's called Making Connections. I have it posted on my Vote for Diane website. The short answer is, as I already indicated, we do have to double our electricity system by 2040 if we want to displace the $16 to $25 billion a year that we're now importing in fossil fuels, which basically drains $1 trillion out of the Ontario economy every year. We've shown in our plan how we do it. I'm glad to hear that Katie's trying to figure it out. That's great. We did a detailed model last year, and it's pretty clear. We do need the nuclear plants we're now operating, Bruce and Darlington. Darlington in particular, we've already spent most of the billions of dollars that it'll take to refurbish that plant. The Pickering plant is scheduled to close in a few years anyway. It's old, the units are small, it's close to huge population centers, so it's going to close. We should not build any more new nuclear in Ontario. It's aside from the fact that we don't have anything to do with the waste, which is clearly very dangerous. We simply don't need that kind of electricity. What nuclear is very good for is for steady baseload that's the same all the time. That's not what we need in Ontario. Our load curve goes like this, up and down, up and down, and up and down, that daily, weekly, and seasonally, and nuclear is really bad at accommodating that. In addition, nuclear is now more expensive than renewables. So we can provide all the electricity that we need. Of course, we also have to be smart. We shouldn't be wasting so much electricity. Nearly 2/3 of the primary energy that we use in Ontario is wasted. So the first thing we need to do is not just replace the supply, but also get much smarter about what we use. And again, the Ford government canceled most of the conservation programs. We do need storage, absolutely. Lithium-ion batteries, that's what people tend to think of as storage. That is very good for very short-term storage, 1 to 4 hours. We're going to have a lot of lithium-ion batteries in Ontario as this decade goes on, especially in cars, and they can provide double duty. They can be really helpful in managing the very short-term peaks. But lithium-ion batteries are a dumb way of dealing with longer-term storage, and they're too expensive. So one question I saw in the chat was what happens when you can't use them anymore? The lithium-ion batteries, after they're used in cars, can still be used for many more years as stationary storage. And after that, they can be recycled. A lot of people still think the lithium-ion batteries can't be recycled. That's obsolete. The world leader in recycling lithium batteries is a Canadian company, Li-Cycle. They're interviewed on my podcast, Green Economy Heroes. If you want to hear interviews with the leading green business leaders across Canada, check it out. It's called Green Economy Heroes. In addition, there's all kinds of new chemistries coming. I've interviewed one of the leading designers of zinc batteries, for example. There's ways of making batteries more modular, developed by a young woman out of Alberta. So that we have lots of different ways of storing electricity, but many of the best ones don't involve batteries at all. You can think, for example, about HydroStore. If you've been watching this in the news, they just got a $250 million investment from Goldman Sachs, who scoured the world looking for the best electricity storage options. And the one they picked was right here in Toronto, HydroStore, because they've got an absolutely brilliant way of storing electricity over longer periods of time, basically using holes in the ground and water and air. For seasonal storage, we're going to need hydrogen. It's an existing technology. It's well proven. The costs do have to come down, but ramping it up is going to bring the cost down. One of the things announced at the Glasgow Climate Summit in November was a World Hydrogen Catapult, an enormous program around the world to vastly accelerate hydrogen, and that will bring the costs tumbling down, just as we've seen already with solar and wind and battery storage. Costs have come down 80–90% in a decade. We can probably see the same thing in electrolyzation of electricity into hydrogen and back and forth. In addition, we have lots of other ways of storing energy. We don't have to store everything as electricity. Quite often what we need is either heat or cold. So the Windsor Casino is actually one of Ontario's leaders in making ice at night when electricity is cheap and clean, and then using it during the day for cooling. So we have so many different options, and that's one of the reasons I'm interviewing people around the country. You will see all of these options being discussed in our roadmap. There's also increasing opportunities for scavenging heat and colds. So we see some great projects now taking heat out of sewers and using that for heating and cooling buildings. So the first step in any energy business is to waste less. And the second step is then to match what we need with what we can provide. And we can do that in Ontario, and we've shown how.
Thanks, Diane. Listen, I think the next question, which is in French, and I'm going to turn to Ashvina, picks up on the theme that all three of you have been mentioning, including Diane with the alternatives. So Ashvina, can you read it in French and then a little bit of an interpretation too, please?
Thank you, Jim. I will start by reading the question in French, then I will translate it into English, and feel free to respond either in French or in English. La question est la suivante. Dans un récent article de la CBC, le gouvernement a déclaré qu'il collabora avec les provinces et les territoires pour établir un conseil pan-canadien du réseau électrique afin de promouvoir les investissements dans les infrastructures d'électricité propre. Que pensez-vous de ces technologies émergentes et de leur coût pour les Canadiens, et dans quelle mesure sont-elles vraiment écologiques? The question is, In a recent CBC article, the government said it will work with the provinces and territories to establish a pan-Canadian grid council to promote clean electricity infrastructure investments. What are your thoughts on these emerging technologies and their cost to Canadians, and how clean are they really? Thank you.
So let's go to Katie first, and then Sandy, and then Diane.
Yeah, so it's, I'm happy to answer this. So one of the solutions to the electricity question is actually to have greater inter-provincial transmission. And so that's what the project is really about. And so if you think of Ontario and our proximity to Quebec, for example, and their abundant hydroelectricity, so the more transmission that we have, the more lines that we have where it goes back and forth, it means that we could potentially use more of Quebec's hydro, for example. So certainly I think it's great that we have this federal investment in this, and that's something that an Ontario Liberal government would certainly want to work with the federal government to see how much we can bring that investment into the province and work on increasing those transmissions between the provinces.
Thank you. Sandy.
Oh, oui, merci pour la question. C'est une bonne question. Je vais essayer de répondre en français, mais j'imagine que je vais retraite à l'anglais. Mais premièrement, le changement climatique ou la crise climatique, c'est un problème qui n'est pas une responsabilité fédérale ou provinciale, c'est une responsabilité de tous les niveaux de nos gouvernements. Et la question à propos de la coût de ces les investissements qu'on a besoin et les coûts, c'est vraiment ce que nous devrions faire. C'est un problème qu'on doit faire face à, parce que la coût de le changement climatique ne doit pas rester sur les individus. C'est un problème collectif et c'est quelque chose que nous devrions répondre collectivement. Et à propos les choses qu'on doit faire pour d'avoir le succès qu'on a besoin, il faut que nous avons tout type des idées. Et nous avons maintenant un gouvernement avec Doug Ford qui a décidé avant qu'il y a des choses qu'il ne va pas faire. Mais l'idée les liens, je crois que c'est le mot lien entre Québec et Ontario, c'est devant nous. C'est une solution qui est vraiment devant nous. C'est vraiment possible, c'est raisonnable et c'est possible. Mais il faut que nous avons ce type de réunion et d'avoir tous les experts pour s'assurer que nous avons des avancements avec le changement climatique, mais tout le monde vient avec nous. C'est pas un fardeau pour un individu, un gouvernement. Nous avons besoin de tous pour tous les gens et aussi toutes les idées pour combattre vraiment cette crise.
Thank you. Diane.
Je conviens à la plupart que Sandy a dit, mais je saurais plus vite aussi en anglais. Aussi, il y a les gens qui peut-être n'ont pas compris ce que tu as dit dans les dernières minutes. I agree with most of what Sandy had to say. When I was commissioner, I looked intently at this question of interconnections. Interconnections are important because even if it's not sunny or windy in one place, it tends to be sunny or windy somewhere else. And the hotspots for wind in Canada aren't in Southern Ontario. We have some in Northern Ontario. We have some, certainly the hotspots for sun in Canada are in the prairie provinces. So there are some real advantages to having connections between one area of Canada and the other. But Canada is really big. And Ontario is really big. Ontario alone is 1,500 kilometers wide. So the benefit of trying to build more interprovincial pipelines is less important for Ontario than it is anywhere else in the country. We do already have local connections with Manitoba on the western border. We have significant connections with Quebec on the eastern border, and those connections are being upgraded right now as we speak by Hydro One to increase the ability to import power from Quebec. But the systems are very different. So the Ontario and Quebec operate their systems in different ways. We don't have DC connections with Quebec by and large, which would allow the free exchange of electricity. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of technical reasons, but the short answer is it's a great idea in principle to have a bigger national grid. It's not that important for Ontario. We do trade electricity very actively with Quebec. We're probably going to do more of that. The major new transmission initiative in Ontario is one that's making our grid dirtier, and that's the Erie Connector. This is a new transmission line that the Ford government has announced to build across Lake Erie so that we can import dirty electricity from the United States. And that's not good for our future and isn't a good use of money, but that's what we're doing. Well, that's what he's doing.
Thank you all three for waiting in. Rich, I'm going to go to you. Oh, you're on mute. Gotcha.
I haven't heard that for a while. Thank you. As leaders, it's imperative that we have concepts or solutions that are preventative, not reactive to situations. So I'll ask in this order, and I'll go to Diane, Sandy, and Katie. How can we improve recycling in Ontario and focus on waste reduction? Diane?
Well, Rich, that's certainly a hot button issue. Recycling is not that important. Recycling is a distraction compared to all the important things we have to do. Anybody who talks about recycling as an important way of dealing with climate, forgive me, isn't looking at the facts. One of the very last thing I did as commissioner 2 days before my office was abolished was I published an analysis of the average footprint of Ontarians, and you will see that half of the carbon footprint of Ontarians is from just four things. Driving, we drive the most polluting vehicles in the entire world. Heating leaky homes, flying, and eating beef. Anybody who's talking about recycling and not driving, recycle plastic and not meat, is not talking about what matters most. Recycling has been pushed by the plastics industry to say, oh, don't worry, it's okay to use all those disposable plastics as we recycle them. And that's just not true. Less than 10% of the plastics, the so-called disposable plastics, so-called recycled plastics, are actually recycled. They end up causing enormous damage all around the world, as well as making the public space ugly. And we've been trying for 40 years. We invented the blue box here in Ontario. We have a lot to be proud of. We've worked really, really hard on it. One of my largest cases ever was on the financing of the blue box, which costs hundreds of millions of dollars every year. The short answer is it does not work. And continuing to pour money into it is a snare and a delusion. The green bin is much more important. Keeping organics out of landfill is very important. And I saw the question about the woman who was very frustrated about not being able to do that in multi-unit high-rise, and that's important. But you really have to keep your eye on the ball. And if we want, we need cheap, fast, and transformative change. And we're not going to get that by looking at the little things. We have to look at the big things. And the big things are driving, leaky buildings, flying, and beef. And that's where we need to be paying our attention. We do have a zero waste section in our plan. I've put the link in the Q&A a few times, but you can look it up on my website, votefordiane.ca. You see we've got a whole section on zero waste and the circular economy, and we should do that. It's much more important for things like critical minerals. Minerals are precious. We're going to need them. Taking them once and throwing them away is idiotic. We need to take care of them. But the main answer for plastics, which are what are destroying our recycling system, is not to pretend that we can recycle them better. The main answer is to use far less of them, to ban most disposable plastics, and then to make sure that the companies that create the plastics have to take them back and make new products out of them. They have always refused to do that because it's much cheaper for them to blame the public and say, you're bad, you didn't wash out your peanut butter jar properly. That's them dumping their responsibility on you. Reject it.
Thank you. Diane, Sandy?
Well, I'm going to start with Diane's level of cynicism that I kind of agree with at this point, and that's about litter day. And so this is a provincial government that's touted they have no climate plan whatsoever. They've eroded all of our environmental protections, but they introduced litter day. And so I was asked by a journalist to say, does Ontario even have a minister of the environment? And I did say that we need a minister of the environment every day, not just on litter day, because while it's important for us to pick up litter, Girl Guides have been doing it without the government's pushing it for years and years, it cannot be used as a distraction. That is not the check mark that we need when it comes to addressing a climate or addressing plastic pollution. So when it comes to plastic pollution, people are concerned. We know it's in our streams, it's in our bodies. I mean, it's something that we need to address. I will let you know that, we have introduced a private member's motion to ban single-use plastics. We have it in part of our Green New Democratic deal, but we are focusing on what is also important to your organization and your white paper, and that is a circular economy. And so producer responsibility is important. If the producers have to pay the cost of the packaging, the plastics that they are producing, hopefully, as Diane said, they will produce less. And I think we also have to understand the cost that is borne by municipalities for our recycling and composting programs that, producers, the people that are producing the waste don't bear, and the province doesn't bear. It's mostly borne by our residential taxpayers. So we need to work closely with municipalities, like industry and also Stewardship Ontario is a great group to establish more responsibility for producers when it comes to waste diversion, because it's not going away. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of waste incineration in Ontario. And that's being ramped up again because of the failure of this government to address seriously stewardship and producer responsibility, and to enable people's will and people's individual will to be part of the solution and part of the solution, and to answer the fundamental question, which people say all the time when they get their packaging, like, who asked for this? We didn't ask for my cilantro to be wrapped in 3 or 4 layers of plastic. People are outraged by it. It's something that they feel that they can do to contribute to the solution, and we should enable that as well.
Thank you, Sandy. Katie.
Yes, well, I will certainly agree that from a climate perspective, plastic pollution is not the top of the list. But I think still in terms of environmental stewardship more broadly, it is a big concern. We are seeing plastic pollution affect wildlife, affect biodiversity, and as Sandy mentioned, growing research is showing microplastics in our drinking water, showing up in blood samples in our bodies. And so I think, it is still an important piece of the puzzle when we're talking about a good environmental plan. We still need to figure out how we're going to protect Ontarians from this. I will agree as well that, the recycling numbers are not great in Ontario. Ontarians do produce a lot of waste, and our recycling rates have been stagnant for many, many years. It's a bit discouraging, to say the least. So I think there's no doubt that we have to shift the focus less from it being an individual responsibility. That has been the approach for many years, and there's only so many people who are going to recycle, and we haven't really increased those rates in a long time. So I think we do have to shift to look at how we can shift that focus onto industry, the people who are producing the plastic. One of the things that the previous Liberal government did was bring in legislation and a strategy around a circular economy in Ontario. Of course, then the Ford government has not really taken any action on that over the past 4 years. So that's something that we would revisit and look at how do we address plastic pollution at the root. I mean, the reality is we have to produce less of it, not just expect people to recycle it.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, we're wading in very deeply now. I know how righteous we all feel when we put things in the green bin or the blue box. It's discouraging when you see how little of that is really truly worth feeling righteous about. That's a big issue. One other that occurs as well, and it was represented in the questions today in the Q&A, and that is the position that your individual parties will have in working with the Indigenous or First Nation populations across this province on environmental issues. We'd love to hear a little more on that. So why don't we go with Diane first?
Well, absolutely. The relationship with Indigenous people is enormously important. I hope you remember, Jim, in 2017, when I delivered my report, Good Choices, Bad Choices. The feature article in that report was on the disproportionate effect of pollution on First Nations.
Yeah.
My powerful advice to the legislature that environmental justice has to be part of reconciliation. You will not be surprised that I took that awareness and knowledge, as well as extensive efforts to reach out to the Indigenous community, into our roadmap. And that's why we have extensive measures for Indigenous climate leadership in the plan. As I think I mentioned earlier, we've pledged $1 billion for Indigenous climate leadership, which no one else has. We have pledged to recognize Indigenous protected and conserved areas as determined by Indigenous communities in priority to mining and logging interests across Ontario. That's the only way we're going to be able to protect the 30% of Ontario that I can't remember if it was Sandy or Katie mentioned. That cannot be done without Indigenous people. 1% of Ontario is 1 million hectares. We also need to think about Indigenous people in urban areas. We have, all of us who are not Indigenous have come to this country over the last few centuries and taken over this land and made no place left here for Indigenous people. So you'll see in our plan, we've got a provision for Indigenous land guardians. So for example, there's been some talk about planting trees. Well, one of the things we should be doing is planting food trees in urban areas. And then someone has to look after them. And Indigenous land guardians could play a really important role in helping to grow food in our cities, reestablish their own traditional historical connection with these areas, have places for ceremony and for celebrating our relationship with the earth. We also have to pay attention to the disproportionate poverty of First Nations. And so the measures we have in our plan for succeeding together, leaving no one behind, those will be particularly important for Indigenous people, as well as our dedicated funding for adaptation, again, specifically for the most vulnerable. So over and over again, paying attention to our obligation to be good ancestors, as the Indigenous people have taught us, requires us to think hard about how we do what we want to do anyway. And there are some really good examples of this. There's a wonderful program in Manitoba that maybe you've heard of. Again, I had it on my podcast. More than half of the licensed geothermal installers in all of Manitoba are Indigenous. And that's because of a program set up by Aki Energy that doesn't require any government grants and doesn't require any charitable funding, but actually uses the savings from getting people off emergency services and into stable employment, and use that to fund really detailed, culturally specific training programs that are now allowing Indigenous people on reserve to put in geothermal on reserve, get them off diesel, give them some dignity, and in addition, dramatically reduce their energy costs. So we've got good examples. We just need to build on them, and we've pledged to do so.
Diane, great answer. Just a couple of, we're trying to be very even-handed in this and give all three members plenty of chance to speak. We're not using the chat box, and please don't answer the questions because they disappear and we don't get a chance to find them and ask all three. So don't answer the Q's and A's, we'll ask them. You can answer live, okay? So let's go to Sandy, please, next on the First Nation issue, and then we'll go to Katie.
So I have the honor and privilege of having my seatmate, who is MPP Saul Mamakwa from Kiwetnong. And so he is one of our three Indigenous MPPs. And I learn from Saul every single day. And I have sat beside him to watch him raise these heartbreaking issues with this government and be met with, in some instances, contempt, silence, and inaction. So I've watched Saul talk about his bills to recognize the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. He moved water as a public right bill. He talks always, when we talk about, the batteries for electric vehicles, Doug Ford said he's going to get on a bulldozer and go up to the Ring of Fire. But, this isn't sovereign land. So the whole idea of free, prior, and informed consent is not being acknowledged and recognized by this this government, and it needs to. And Ontario, we all need to understand that we are treaty people. Ontario is a signatory to a treaty agreement, and that we need to begin just to start by honoring that commitment before we move forward. I mean, the fact that we have boil water advisories that have lasted for 30 plus years in our communities is unacceptable. The fact that we have Indigenous people living with no proper housing. I went, my party leader, Andrew Horvath, went with Saul on a boil water tour of Northern Ontario to see firsthand the shame that is Ontario, to see mothers not being able to bathe their children because they'll end up with rashes. So when it comes to the environment, we talked earlier about our Green New Democratic Deal that talks about, we need to understand our movement when it comes to addressing the climate change in the environment. It has to be rooted in equity, and it has to be rooted in reconciliation. We owe ourselves, we owe Indigenous peoples nothing less than that. And we are not going to be truly successful. We can't call this success if we don't make sure that we center our action around Indigenous people in the province of Ontario. It's something I'll just share with you that, my children and two of my grandchildren are, actually three, I have a third new, are Indigenous Mohawk children. And so it's also very personal to me. And I see through their eyes what it feels like for them to experience this kind of maltreatment from the provincial government. And so you can count on me to be on the forefront of making sure this is never ignored. And if we were to form government, the Ontario NDP, you can believe that we will have Indigenous ministers that will also be acting on this as well. So thank you for that question. And sorry, I'm just getting so fired up, but it's a terrible disgrace the way we are conducting ourselves in the province of Ontario when it comes to our Indigenous communities.
Sandy, wonderful passion. I love it. And just before I go to Katie, it has always astounded me that we can send the Canadian military DART system anywhere in the world and in 48 hours of potable water. Why can't we do that here in Ontario or across Canada? It just drives me crazy. Sorry, Katie, on to you.
That's okay. That's okay. I think the way I look at so many of these issues is that the climate crisis is not the only issue we're facing. It's not the only crisis we're facing. We're facing so many other urgent, huge issues. And there's no doubt that reconciliation with Indigenous communities is also another issue that is top of that list. And I think that, we're at a point now where so many Ontarians realize that and want to see action. And they understand that we have a lot to be ashamed of, really, of our treatment of Indigenous peoples, and that we have to, words are not enough. We need actions to make it right. And so on this issue, and with so many others, I look at where can we find those overlaps between the things that are going to get us to our climate goals that are also going to move reconciliation forward. And I think that there are so many. There are so many areas where we can do both. And so, like I alluded to originally, a big part of our plan is going to be focused on nature-based solutions. So we've talked about planting a lot of trees. We've talked about protecting a lot of Ontario, a lot of lands. There is no doubt that that can only be done in close partnership with Indigenous communities on helping to figure out where are the places that we want to protect. And then looking at the planting of new trees, looking at where a big part of that is restoring natural lands. And again, that would have to be something that would be done in partnership with Indigenous communities, looking at how do we restore their natural lands? How do we let them hopefully take the lead on using their knowledge to restore the lands to how they were, right? When you talk about planting trees, that is good, but there's so many questions around where are you planting them? What kind of trees are you planting? And so that's where, we would hope to do that in partnership with them. And again, on going back to energy issues and electricity, that's another area where I think that there are solutions that get to our climate goals and our reconciliation goals around looking at energy use in Indigenous communities. Many are still using things like diesel. How do we make them top of the list for switching over to renewable energies and hopefully giving them some energy sovereignty in that. So those are just a few of the examples of where I think we can get at policies that get towards our climate goals and reconciliation.
Terrific. Thanks, all three of you. Over to Ashvina with a question in French.
Thank you, Jim. So same as earlier, I will start by reading the question in French, then I will translate it into English. And do feel free to use your language of preference, English or French, to respond to the question. La question est la suivante. Pour certains d'entre nous, les districts de la région nord, les hivers sont longs et les étés de plus en plus chauds. Y aura-t-il une aide particulière pour nous, géothermique ou autre système? The question is, for some of us in the northern region districts, winters are very cold and summers are very hot. Is there a specific help for us, such as geothermal or any other system? Thank you.
You're on mute, Jim.
Oh, thank you, Rich. Thank you. It happens all the time. Katie, do you mind if you go first and I'll take my embarrassment like a man?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess in a province like Ontario, it's hard to know where you mean by north. I've looked a lot at the technology around heat pumps, and so those are a really great solution for Ottawa's climate. So, we do get quite cold and quite hot. And I think this is, a perfect example where a lot of Ontarians, when I'm just talking to people don't seem to realize that we can use something like a heat pump even in Ottawa's climate, but the technology is at the point where we can. And so maybe if people don't know the technology, most homes, at least in, not very far north, use natural gas for heating, but we can actually use something like heat pumps for heating, which use electricity for heating, which is great. Again, as long as we keep our electricity system low emitting. The other amazing thing about heat pumps is that they actually do cooling as well. And so I would love to see us invest in trying to speed up that transition from natural gas furnaces to heat pumps, and especially focusing it on where are the populations that are most vulnerable to heat. We know that one of the things that's going to happen is that we are already locked in to some degree of warming. We are going to have more heat waves. We all saw what happened in BC last summer with really devastating and deadly heat waves. And we know it's only a matter of time until we experience those deadly heat waves here in Ontario. And by making sure that especially our most vulnerable populations first get prioritized for getting switched over to something like a heat pump, not only is that going to help us in reducing our emissions and reaching our climate goals, but it also has the secondary benefit of providing people with cooling that they might not already have access to. And that cooling is going to be life-saving when we do end up in a heat wave scenario. So I think that we are at the point where we have a lot of technology available to us. Places colder than Ottawa, I think that does get a little bit more difficult in terms of heating, but the reality is we do need to focus on that low-hanging fruit, and most of the population lives in Ontario, we could be converting over to something like a heat pump that does heating and cooling. And right now we're not doing that. And so I think that has to be a top priority going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Diane?
Yes, hi. Thanks for the question. The first step for any building isn't to change the source of heating or cooling. The first thing is to change the building. As I mentioned earlier, heating leaky buildings is one of the biggest sources of climate pollution and air pollution in Ontario, and it's very expensive. So the absolute first thing, and it's particularly important in the north because the winters are colder, is to make the buildings as close as possible to a passive house. We know, well, when I did my electricity report in 2018, approximately 16% of Ontarians were heating their homes with electric baseboard heating, and they tended to be in the oldest houses, most of them rural, with the least energy efficiency, which is why you sometimes get extraordinarily large bills because most of the heat is just escaping into the outdoors. That creates great hardship. So the very first step is to make those buildings much more efficient. One of the things I reported on was some programs for particularly low income housing, of how incredibly effective it's been to bring in conservation programs that improve the building envelope first and conserve energy and water, and then do something about the energy source. So that's the first thing to do. The second thing to do is to convert baseboard heating to heat pumps. Baseboard heating is incredibly expensive and incredibly inefficient. Heat pumps are at least 3 times more efficient and can be much more than that. You asked about geothermal. Geothermal heat is 17 times more efficient than baseboard heating, and it isn't affected by the fact that it gets really cold in the north. So in our plan, you'll see, and I showed on the slide, we have the start of a geothermal industry in Ontario. It's still pretty small and very expensive. And the main reason for that is it hasn't had a chance to scale up. So we've pledged to put in geothermal in 100 schools. Schools are the first place to do geothermal. It's cheaper. They've got large flat areas around them. The schoolyards often need upgrading anyway to provide better learning environments for the kids, and so as to not create an urban heat island effect that cooks the school in June and September. And doing 100 of those would get our geothermal industry from where it is now, which is basically small and bespoke and very expensive, to being able to operate at scale. So it'd be much less expensive. And then you could start thinking about whether it makes sense for individual homes. At the moment, geothermal doesn't make sense for an individual home unless you're already digging a hole anyway. If you're digging a hole anyway, by all means, put geothermal in. If you're building a fairly big building like the new student residence down in my riding, geothermal makes tremendous amount of sense. But it has to come down in cost in the same way solar and wind and batteries and hydrogen are. And we need to do that by scaling it up, and that's how we do it. There are also lots of opportunities for people in remote areas, many more opportunities to have solar because you don't have other buildings all around you shading you. So solar it's not a replacement for fixing the building, because if you just try to put enough solar on to heat a leaky house, it'll cost too much. But if you make your house much more efficient and then you put solar on the roof, well, then you are providing an additional local independent source of energy that doesn't go out if the grid goes down. It can shade your roof in the summer so the house doesn't heat up as much, and it can provide energy all year round. Not as much in the winter, but still quite a bit.
Very good. Thank you, Diane. Sandy, last word on this particular issue.
Oui, plusieurs mots. Je suis très fière que dans notre caucus, nous avons plusieurs députés qui viennent du Nord et qui sont francophones. Il y a Gilles Bison, nous avons MPP Michael Manta et surtout France Jalina. Il y en a d'autres. Mais ça nous donne une occasion de comprendre vraiment l'expérience des gens qui viennent du Nord et des francophones. Et maintenant, je vais parler en anglais, mais because of our Northern and Francophone MPPs, out of our 40 MPPs that we currently have in the House, there are many that have bring to us their lived experience, the experience of their constituents, the different life experience that they have in Northern Ontario, and that all, it's like, it's not one size fits all when it comes to addressing the climate change and how it impacts others. We know that there are vast distances, for Northern Ontarians to drive, to get to hospitals, to get to medical appointments, to visit their relatives and friends, to get their kids to school. So the cost of gas is a huge issue for them. And one of the things that Gilles Bison has made certain that we need to address is the fact that, that there's gas gouging, that energy companies continue to prey on or take advantage of people that are not in a position now to be able to adapt things like electric vehicles, particularly in the North, because, as Katie mentioned, these solutions don't always work in very, very cold climates. So electric vehicles may not be affordable for folks, but it also may be that these batteries don't function in those kind of cold climates or those long distances. That's when we might need to look at technologies like, for example, hydrogen as an option to help make sure that we don't overlook people in Northern Ontario. I mean, the very fact that the heating costs, as Diane alluded to, in Northern Ontario certainly will be compounded by how far north and how long the winters are. The fact that people may be relying on expensive electric heat, don't have access to retrofit programs to help them make sure that their homes are more efficient, that they can help us to reduce greenhouse gases, but also helps people to save money. These are some of the differing experiences in Northern Ontario that we need to take into account. It's why, as I said, the Green New Democratic Deal is about it's about looking at and making sure that it's about justice and it's about equity and inclusion, so we don't forget about everybody's lived experience and how our solutions will impact people differently. And finally, I think that what the experience of people living in Northern Ontario and Francophones in Northern Ontario gives us a really great opportunity to hone our skills, to actually come up with solutions that work for everybody. And their experience needs to be centered in some of the solutions that we put forward. So merci beaucoup et miigwech and nawa to everyone for that wonderful question.
Merci. We're down to the last two questions we're going to ask, and Rich is going to ask the second last one. Away we go, Rich.
Okay, thank you, Jim. As we know, climate change impacts greatly the quality of human life in a multitude of ways, one of which is altered food availability. So how is each party going to address food insecurity in Ontario? And we'll just go in the reverse order of what you just did, going from Sandy to Diane to Katie.
Yeah, so food insecurity is also a social justice issue as much as it is an environmental issue. I mean, we see people that in Ontario that are living on ODSP and OW rates that have been frozen for decades. In fact, 15 years of a Liberal government did not raise ODSP or OW rates to come anywhere near the level, the poverty rate in the province of Ontario. I mean, Mike Harris cut them by some 20%. The Liberal government did nothing to restore those. So people can't afford food in the province of Ontario. Kids are going to school hungry. So this is a social justice issue. When it comes to the food security and essentially the food supply chain, I mean, we just need to understand that, farmers feed cities, and that we have a government currently that is prepared to pave over farmland to build highways, that has no understanding or no plan as to how we're going to ensure that we can continue to have any kind of control or sovereignty over being able to feed the people of our province that doesn't even take that into consideration is frightening, quite frankly. And so, we have, in addition to understanding that we need to make sure that people have income, that have access to food, that literally can put food on their table, that cannot be separated from the discussion of climate change and an environment. And that, in fact, we also understand that we need to stop sprawl, that we will freeze the urban boundaries, and we will take all of that into consideration when we are looking at the problem of how we are going to continue to make sure that people in the province of Ontario are fed, that farmers and agricultural communities can continue to count on the lifestyle and the work that they've been doing for generations. We will make sure that we talk to experts like the Ontario Federation of Agriculture or the National Farmers Union, who all are opposed to this urban sprawl land grab scheme of the government. And they're the people that we need to be making sure are centered in the conversation about food security. So it's an excellent question. And I thank you very much for asking it.
Oh, you're welcome, Sandy. And now Diane is going to respond to the same question. Diane?
Absolutely. And I should point out to anyone who's put questions into the Q&A, I answered a number of questions. They don't show up under open anywhere once they're entered, but they're all under the answered tab. And I suggest you look there, and that included the answer to the food question. Sandy, I wish I saw anything in your plan about stopping sprawl or freezing urban boundaries. It's not there. I absolutely agree that it should be. It's pivotal to our plan. So the very first thing for food security is to protect the farmland that's left. We've already paved a lot of our best farmland, put highways through it. It's absolutely critical to protect every single spot that's left. Soil is precious. It takes thousands of years to make. The second thing is we need a grocery code of conduct, which we have pledged for, because most of the money from our food dollar goes to the big corporate interests. Very little of it goes to farmers. The third thing is we need to protect soil health. Healthy soil is critical to our ability to grow food, especially as the hammer blows of climate gets worse. Soil health in Ontario has been decreasing for a generation under all of the old parties. I did a report on soil health when I was commissioner. It's available on my website. And really, we know that if we want to be able to keep growing food here, and certainly I do, I like eating every day, we need to dramatically increase the health of our soil, and we know how to do it. There are at least three key parts of that. The first is we need to rebuild the agricultural extension system. Right now, when I was young, the Ministry of Agriculture used to have an elaborate system of education and help for farmers and even backyard gardeners. And they abandoned all of that and left all of the task of providing advice to people growing food to the chemical industry. So they sell chemicals. We need to replace that. We need to bring back extension. We need to use government procurement to support food growing by local farmers, and we need crop loss protection. In many places, including even the US Midwest, crop loss premiums are reduced for farmers who plant cover crops because that rebuilds organic material in the soil. And we don't do that in Ontario, and it's just silly. It increases crop losses, and we don't provide any financial support for farmers who are trying to get off chemical agriculture, moving to a soil health basis, which is exactly what we need them to do. That's not enough. We need to minimize food waste. Again, we've got a zero waste section in our plan, and minimizing food waste is one of the top things we can do in the world. If you look at the drawdown list, we need to grow food in the city. I mentioned a bit of that before. We've got enormous opportunities, both indoor and outdoor in cities. And the more we clean up pollution and get rid of fossil fuels, the cleaner the air will be, both for our health and for the food that we'd like to grow here. And of course, we need to think about purchasing power. So Sandy mentioned this. I think we were the first to pledge to double ODSP so that people can afford to buy food. We can expect, as a result of climate change, that food prices will go up significantly and unpredictably. Many crops that we really treasure, like coffee and bananas, are seriously threatened, but not just the pleasures of life, also the staples. Large areas of the world that grow grain that provide most of human calories are already at the temperature limits of those crops. and 40 years of attempting to breed them out of those temperature limits haven't succeeded. So we can really expect a much higher risk of simultaneous catastrophic crop failures, as the IPCC has told us. So putting houses on our good farmland just when being able to grow food here is increasingly important is nuts. And that's why the very first thing I looked for in the NDP plan was, what are you doing to freeze urban boundaries and stop sprawl? And it's not there, but it's essential. It's essential, and every party should pledge to it, and every party should do it. And we need to think of soil as valuable. We need to think of water as valuable. We have to treat them that way instead of just treating them as dirt that we can always count on, because we can't.
Thank you, Diane. And finally, Katie.
Yes, thank you. Well, I will agree with both Diane and Sandy about, that this issue is so related to sprawl. I mean, right now we are basically paving over farmland for things like new highways, and we absolutely need to stop that. We need to protect the existing farmland. And Diane talked a lot about the soil health, which I think is so important. And it's not just important in terms of our ability to grow healthy food, but also it's an important part of fighting climate change. There's a lot of really interesting research around restorative farming and how different farming techniques can either encourage carbon to be released from the soil or captured in the soil. And right now there's no sort of incentives for farmers to adopt more restorative farming techniques versus less restorative techniques. And so, we're sort of thinking about how can we create some sort of an incentive for farmers to essentially do carbon storage, as essentially as part of their business model along with growing food. And something like that is also going to help make farming continue to be an economically viable activity, because I think that's another concern. And that is part of the sprawl issue, is that a lot of farmers are actually choosing to stop farming and selling their land, because as we know, once the climate, and it is getting more variable, it becomes harder and harder to farm, to produce food, and it becomes an even more difficult business model. And it has always been a hard job, and it's only getting harder. So I think that's where, again, we need to look at these solutions that can kind of tackle a bunch of problems at once. And I think looking at how we can provide some sort of a, support or financial incentive for restorative farming measures is one of those potential innovative solutions that kind of addresses a few different angles of this problem.
Terrific. We're down to our last question, and we've taxed you a great deal with, I think, some superb questions from our participants, which is amazing. Now we're going to turn tables and ask for your deep advice for our own organization. A question that came in the question and answer area is, how does your party see the role of RTO-ERO members and their friends? 80% of our 82,000 members live in Ontario. How do we, as members of RTO-ERO, support local NGOs that are focused on citizen and community environmental science? Let's go with you, Diane. Very short, because we're 3 minutes away from wrapping up.
There's no magic to this. What do NGOs need? They need time, talent, treasure, and ties. They need you to volunteer. They need to donate money. They need you to use your connections. And to offer your skills. Those things are all important, but I wouldn't miss the election. I mean, NGOs are great. Everybody loves supporting NGOs, and you should. But for the next 5 weeks, that's not what's most important. For the next 5 weeks, what's most important is electing climate leaders. Don't stand by. If I saw the flyer that you circulated, if you want to have influence, you have to get involved. You've got 5 weeks. Stand up, donate, volunteer, get really active. We're on track to have another Ford government which is going to be utterly destructive to everything we've talked about today. If you don't want that, you need to be out there working for it right now.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Katie.
Well, I will say similar to that. I think, I previously, most of my career has been in the nonprofit sector. And for this election, I decided to leave my nonprofit job and run for office because I think it's time for those of us who care about climate to get political. We are at a now or never moment. So I would urge your members to get out and engage in the political process. There's a great group called Green PAC that is will be looking at putting forward candidates across the political spectrum who are strong on environment and climate to support. So you can check that out, especially if you're looking to engage in a less partisan way. But I will also say, one of the biggest things that we can all do is actually talk to those in our lives about how concerned we are about climate. I feel like it's one of those weird things where a lot of us, many of us are very stressed about it. It's something we worry about, but we don't often talk about it. And I think the more that we talk about it, tell your friends, tell your neighbors that you are planning to vote for climate this election and that that's one of your key issues. And the more we talk about it, the more it raises the awareness and the more other people will join you.
Very good. Wonderful opportunity. Thank you, first of all, for all of the participants who joined. And let me assure the panelists that this RTO ERO membership are incredibly active, incredibly ready to go to the polls all the time, and are strong advocates, not only for the environment, but for a number of other really critical issues for members and seniors. We've been listening today to MPP Sandy Shaw. Unfortunately, technology gobbled her up. Katie Gibbs, the Liberal Party of Ontario for Ottawa Centre, which is terrific. And Diane Sachs, environmental and climate critic and deputy leader of the Ontario Green Party. I do want to thank all three of our participants, panelists. They really did a terrific job on an issue that has no limit to the number of questions and absolutely no limit to the kind of action that people can take and need to take right away. I will say to you that this event, like the previous two, has been recorded. Those of you who participate will receive this by email, a connection by email, so that you can view it and share it with your friends. But it's also on our YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/RTOERO, along with a number of other great videos in that area. So we hope these town hall sessions have helped answer some of the questions you might have. Sometime in the next 5 weeks, you'll let everyone know. And on June the 2nd, get active, get out there, place your vote. And thanks again so much for joining us, and take care and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you to Diane and Katie, who are still with us, and to Rich and the team that put it all together. Fantastic work. Thank you. Farewell.
Thanks so much for having
everyone.
us. Bye.